There comes a time in every man's life when he realizes he's outlived everything he once held dear. For Chago, that moment arrived when the last of his Apache brothers had been buried, leaving him alone with nothing but memories and endless desert. The old warrior found a lone horse by a dried creek, strong, well cared for, but abandoned just like himself. Without hesitation, he spoke the simple truth. "I need a ride, and you need a home." Together, they began a journey across forgotten lands, past ghost towns, and places that existed only in Chago's memories. But would this unlikely partnership finally lead the old warrior to the peace he'd been seeking his entire life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Chago adjusted the worn leather straps of his medicine pouch, feeling the familiar weight of the sacred stones and dried herbs his grandmother had given him 70 years ago. The weathered Apache warrior stood beside the creek bed where he'd found the horse, studying the animal with eyes that had seen too much of war and too little of peace. The horse was magnificent, a dark bay with intelligent eyes and a coat that spoke of careful grooming, though dust now dulled its shine. Someone had loved this animal once. That much was certain. Chago reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a faded black and white photograph, its edges soft with age and handling. 5 young Apache warriors stared back at him from another lifetime, their faces painted for battle, their eyes fierce with the certainty of youth. He was third from the left, barely 25 then, his hair long and braided with eagle feathers, his chest bare except for the turquoise and silver that marked him as a man of standing among his people. The others in the photograph, Thomas, Miguel, Joseph, and Samuel, had all returned to the earth in the decades since, some in battle, others to sickness, the last one to old age just 3 moons ago. "We were going to change the world," he said quietly to the horse, who had wandered closer and now stood within arm's reach. "We believed we could hold back the tide of progress, keep the sacred places sacred, make the government honor the treaties." He folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his pocket. Young men believe many foolish things. The landscape around them told a different story than the one they'd hoped to write. Where once vast grasslands had sustained buffalo herds and Apache camps, now oil derricks punctured the horizon like mechanical prayer flags offering devotion to different gods. The creek where they stood had run clear and deep when Chago was a boy. Now it was little more than a sandy depression with occasional pools that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. Even the mountains in the distance seemed smaller somehow, worn down by decades of mining and development, their peaks crowned with radio towers instead of eagles. Chago had been walking these lands for weeks, ever since Samuel's funeral, searching for something he couldn't name. Home, perhaps, though the reservation where he'd been born had changed beyond recognition. Purpose, maybe, though at 78 he'd outlived most reasons to fight. Or simply peace, the kind of deep bone-settling peace that comes when a man finally understands his place in the great circle of things. The horse nickered softly and stepped closer, close enough for Chago to see the small scars on its flanks, and the way its left ear twitched when vehicles passed on the distant highway. This was an animal that had been ridden hard and put away wet more than once, but there was no meanness in its eyes, no wariness that spoke of mistreatment. If anything, the horse seemed as lost as Chago himself, as if both of them were pieces from different puzzles that somehow fit together. "What's your story, then?" Chago asked, running his weathered hand along the horse's neck. The animal leaned into his touch, a gesture so human in its need for comfort that it made the old warrior's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Someone trained you well. Someone cared about you. But here you are, all alone like the rest of us." The horse wore no brand, but there was a slight discoloration on its left hip where one might have been removed. Its hooves had been recently shod with quality iron, and its teeth showed the kind of care that spoke of regular veterinary attention. This wasn't some wild Mustang or abandoned ranch horse. This animal had been valuable to someone, important, enough to invest time and money in its care, yet here it stood, free as the wind, in a place where no roads led and few people ever ventured. As the morning grew warmer, Chago settled into the shade of a weathered cottonwood and shared his breakfast. With his new companion, jerky made from deer he'd hunted on the reservation, and water from a spring his grandfather had shown him 60 years ago. The horse accepted both offerings with the dignity of an honored guest, and Chago found himself talking as he hadn't talked to another living soul in months. He spoke of the old days, when the Apache had moved freely across this land, following the seasons and the game herds, living in harmony with rhythms older than memory. He told stories his grandfather had shared about the time before the cavalry, when the only sounds at night were coyotes singing and wind through the sage. He described the battles he'd fought as a young man, not against soldiers this time, but against bureaucrats and developers, fighting with lawyers and legislation instead of rifles and war paint. "We thought we were so clever," he said, watching the horse methodically work through a handful of oats he'd found in his pack. "We learned their language, their laws, their ways of doing business. We put on suits and ties and sat in boardrooms, making arguments about treaties and sacred sites. And for a while, we thought we were winning. But the photograph in his pocket told a different truth. One by one, his brothers had grown tired of the fight, worn down by decades of small defeats and hollow victories. Thomas had moved to Phoenix and died of diabetes in a VA hospital. Miguel had started drinking after his son was killed in Iraq and never stopped. Joseph had simply walked into the desert one day and never returned, his body found months later by hikers, facing east toward the rising sun. And Samuel had held on the longest, fighting until the very end to preserve what little remained of their world. "Now it's just me," Chago said, scratching behind the horse's ears. "The last of the old guard, too stubborn to die and too tired to keep fighting." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But maybe that's not entirely true anymore. Maybe it's just us now." The horse lifted its head and looked directly at him, as if understanding the weight of what had just been said. In that moment, Chago felt something shift inside his chest. Not quite hope, but something close to it. A sense that perhaps his story wasn't finished after all, that there might be one more chapter to write before the book closed forever. He spent the rest of the day learning the horse's habits and temperament, discovering that the animal responded to gentle pressure and quiet commands, that it had been trained to stand still for mounting and dismounting, and that it seemed to understand far more human speech than most horses ever learned. By evening, when the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and copper, Chago had made his decision. "I'm going to call you Shishili," he said, using the Apache word for heart, "because that's what you've given me today. A reason to keep this old heart beating." The horse turned its head at the sound of its new name, ears pricked forward, as if trying to memorize the syllables. "We'll head north tomorrow, toward the old places. I want to see them one more time, and I think you might understand why that matters." As darkness settled over the desert, Chago built a small fire and settled back against his saddle, which he'd retrieved from a cache hidden near the creek. The horse stood nearby, occasionally stepping closer to the warmth of the flames, and, for the first time in months, Chago didn't feel the crushing weight of solitude pressing down on him. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The desert was unforgiving to travelers, especially old ones. But tonight he had a companion, a purpose, and something that felt remarkably like hope. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had guided his ancestors across this land for countless generations. Chago pulled his blanket closer and closed his eyes, listening to the soft sounds of Shishili moving in the darkness. And for the first time since Samuel's funeral, he slept without dreaming of the dead. 3 days into their journey north, Chago and Shishili crested a ridge that should have revealed the sacred canyon his grandfather had called where the eagles dance. Instead, Chago found himself staring down at a massive construction site, complete with bulldozers, cement mixers, and a sign that made his blood run cold. Future site of Desert Springs Resort and Casino, opening spring 2026. The old warrior dismounted slowly, his arthritic joints protesting after hours in the saddle. Shishili sensed his distress and moved closer, pressing her warm flank against his shoulder. Below them, where generations of Apache had conducted vision quests and burial ceremonies, earth movers scraped away thousands of years of history with each pass of their steel blades. "They can't do this," Chago whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of machinery. "This place is protected. We have treaties, federal laws." But even as he spoke the words, he knew how hollow they sounded. Treaties had been broken before. Laws had been changed or ignored when money was involved. He knelt and began digging through the red dirt with his bare hands, searching for something, anything that might remain of the sacred site. His fingers closed around a piece of rusted metal, and when he pulled it free, he found himself holding half of an old cavalry saber, its blade broken jaggedly in the middle, its brass hilt tarnished nearly black. The weight of it in his palm brought back memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. This was where his great-grandfather had fallen in 1886, cut down by cavalry sabers during the last great uprising. This was where young Apache warriors had made their final stand against the blue-coated soldiers who'd come to force them onto reservations. The sacred spring that gave this place its power had run red with blood that day, and now developers wanted to turn it into a playground for tourists. "Chago Yazi?" The voice behind him made him whirl around, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his belt. A man in an expensive suit and hard hat was climbing the ridge toward him, flanked by 2 security guards in khaki uniforms. The man was young, maybe 40, with the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal or worked with his hands. "I'm Richard Brennan, project manager for Desert Springs Development," the man said, extending a manicured hand that Chago ignored. "I've been hoping to speak with you. We understand you have some concerns about this project." "Concerns?" Chago's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're desecrating a burial ground. You're destroying a site that's been sacred to my people for over 1,000 years. Brennan's smile never wavered. "I appreciate your perspective, Mr. Yazi. I really do. But we've done extensive surveys of this area, archaeological studies, environmental impact assessments, cultural resource evaluations. We've followed all the proper protocols, and I can assure you that no significant historical or cultural artifacts were found." Chago held up the broken saber. "What do you call this?" "A piece of old metal that could have come from anywhere," Brennan replied smoothly. "Look, we're not unreasonable people. Desert Springs Development believes in being a good neighbor to the local community. We're prepared to offer you a very generous consulting fee to help us design culturally appropriate landscaping for the resort. Native plants, maybe some interpretive signs about local history. Get out." Chago's words cut through Brennan's sales pitch like a blade through silk. "I beg your pardon. Get off this mountain. Now, before I forget that I'm too old to fight." "And you're too young to die?" The security guards stepped forward, but Brennan waved them back. "Mr. Yazi, I understand you're upset. Change is never easy, especially for someone of your generation. But this project is going forward whether you approve or not. We have all the necessary permits and approvals. The tribal council has already signed off on it." That last statement hit Chago like a physical blow. The council signed off. Unanimous approval. The casino will provide jobs for tribal members, generate revenue for the reservation. It's a win-win situation for everyone involved. Chago felt something break inside his chest, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. The tribal council, the same council that had once sworn to protect the sacred sites, had sold out for casino money and construction jobs. He should have seen it coming. In his heart, he'd known this day would arrive eventually. The young leaders didn't understand what they were giving up, didn't comprehend the weight of the ancestors' bones beneath their feet. "How long?" he asked quietly. "I'm sorry? How long do I have before you start blasting? Before you bring in the heavy equipment?" Brennan checked his expensive watch. "Groundbreaking is scheduled for next Monday. The ceremonial first shovel, you know, for the cameras and the investors. But the real excavation work begins the following week. 5 days. Chago had 5 days before the sacred canyon would be gone forever, transformed into concrete foundations and swimming pools. 5 days to figure out what, if anything, he could still do to stop this desecration. "There's still time to reconsider our offer," Brennan continued. "A man with your knowledge of local history could be very valuable to our marketing team. We're thinking of calling the main restaurant Chago's Place in honor of local heritage. What do you say?" For a moment, Chago's vision went red around the edges. He felt the broken saber's weight in his hand and wondered how much damage he could do before the security guards could stop him. But Shishili chose that moment to step between him and Brennan, her bulk forcing the developer to take several steps backward. The horse's intervention gave Chago time to breathe, to remember who he was and what he represented. He wasn't a young warrior anymore, full of fury and righteous anger. He was an elder, a keeper of stories and traditions. Violence might feel satisfying in the moment, but it would accomplish nothing except landing him in jail while the bulldozers continued their work. "You have no idea what you're destroying," he said finally, his voice heavy with 78 years of accumulated sorrow. "This isn't just dirt and rocks to you. It's money and opportunity and progress. But to my people, this place is alive. It has a spirit, a purpose, and when you kill it, something irreplaceable dies with it." Brennan's professional smile faltered slightly. "I respect your beliefs, Mr. Yazzie, I really do. But we can't let superstition stand in the way of economic development. The jobs this project will create will last as long as the tourists keep coming," Chago finished. "And when the casino fails, like most of them do, you'll abandon this place and move on to destroy something else. But the sacred spring will still be gone. The burial grounds will still be paved over, and my people will have nothing left but regret and casino debt." He mounted Shishili with more difficulty than he cared to admit, his hands shaking with rage and grief. The horse stood perfectly still, as if understanding that her rider needed steadiness above all else. "This isn't over," Chago said, looking down at Brennan from the saddle. "Actually, it is." Brennan's voice had lost its false friendliness. "Security will be increased starting tomorrow. Anyone attempting to interfere with construction will be arrested for trespassing. I'd strongly advise you to stay away from this site." As they rode down the far side of the ridge, Chago felt the weight of failure settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. This was how it ended then. Not with a glorious last battle, but with permits and paperwork and tribal councils. Bought and paid for by casino developers, the sacred places would die with a whimper, not a war cry. But as the construction site disappeared behind them, Chago found his grip on the reins steadying. He still had 5 days. 5 days to figure out how one old Apache and his horse could accomplish what lawyers and activists had failed to do. It wasn't much, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough to change the world. The abandoned trading post sat like a weathered gravestone against the desert sky, its adobe walls crumbling and its wooden porch sagging under decades of neglect. Chago had stopped here often as a young man, trading deer hides and turquoise for ammunition and coffee, back when the old Navajo trader Joe Begay still kept the place running. Now tumbleweeds had built nests in the corners, and pack rats had made homes in what remained of the roof. Shishili picked her way carefully through the debris scattered around the building's foundation, stepping over rusted cans and broken glass with the delicate precision of a trained cutting horse. Chago dismounted and tied her reins to a hitching post that had somehow survived the years, its wood polished smooth by countless hands and countless storms. Inside the trading post, shafts of sunlight fell through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the stale air. Most of the shelves had been stripped bare by scavengers, but Chago found himself drawn to a display case near the back of the store, its glass cracked but still intact. Inside, covered by decades of dust, lay a collection of forgotten jewelry. Silver, bracelets, beaded necklaces, and in the center a turquoise ring that made his breath catch in his throat. He knew that ring. Had slipped it onto Maria Sandoval's finger 53 years ago, on a summer evening when the desert bloomed with wildflowers and anything seemed possible. She'd been 18 then, with eyes the color of deep water and a laugh that could make eagles stop their circling just to listen. He'd been 25 and full of dreams about changing the world, about building a better future for their children and their children's children. The case's lock had long since rusted away, and the hinges protested with a squeal of metal on metal as Chago lifted the lid. The turquoise ring sat in his palm like a piece of captured sky, its silver band tarnished but unbroken. Maria had given it back to him the day before he left for Vietnam, tears streaming down her face as she told him she couldn't wait for a man who might never come home. "I thought I might find you here." The voice from the doorway made Chago spin around, his hand instinctively moving to his knife. But instead of Richard Brennan or his security guards, he found himself facing an elderly Navajo man with silver and hair braided down his back and skin like well-oiled leather. "Joe?" Chago squinted in the dim light, hardly daring to believe his eyes. "Joe Begay, I thought you were dead." The old trader chuckled, the sound rich and warm in the dusty air. Close to it some days, but not quite ready for the next journey yet. He stepped into the trading post, moving with the careful gait of a man whose joints had seen too many winters. "Been living with my grandson over in Window Rock, but I come back here sometimes. Old habits, you know. Why didn't you ever reopen this place?" Joe shrugged, his eyes taking in the ruins of his life's work. "After the highway got built, people stopped coming. Everything changed. They wanted to shop at Walmart instead of talking to an old Navajo about the price of silver. Progress, they called it." Chago held up the turquoise ring, letting it catch. What little light filtered through the broken roof. "Maria's ring is still here. She came looking for you, you know. After you got back from the war. Heard you were living rough up in the mountains, trying to find yourself again. I wasn't ready. Then, couldn't see past all the things I'd done, all the friends I'd lost." Chago slipped the ring into his shirt pocket, next to the photograph of his fallen brothers. "By the time I came down from the high country, she was married to that banker from Flagstaff, had 3 children with him. Good kids, from what I heard. But she never stopped asking about you when she came through here. How's Chago doing, Joe? Is he well? Is he happy?" Right up until the cancer took her, 5 years ago. The words hit Chago like stones thrown at close range, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Maria was gone, had been gone for 5 years, while he wandered the desert feeling sorry for himself, too proud and too broken to reach out to the people who'd once loved him. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "How could you? You disappeared after Samuel's funeral. Didn't tell anyone where you were going. Your nephew David's been looking for you, worried sick." Chago had almost forgotten about David, his sister's boy who'd grown up calling him Uncle Chago and begging for stories about the old days. The kid must be in his 40s now, probably with children of his own. Another connection severed by Chago's. "Retreat into solitude. They're going to destroy the sacred canyon," Chago said, changing the subject to something easier to bear. "Desert Springs development. They're building a casino where the eagles used to dance." Joe's expression darkened. "I heard rumors, figured it was just talk, politicians making promises they couldn't keep. It's real. I saw the construction site myself. They start blasting next week." The old trader was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the dust on what had once been his front counter. My grandmother used to say that the land remembers everything, every step, every prayer, every drop of blood spilled on its surface. Maybe the developers can pave over the sacred places, but they can't kill the memories. Memories don't stop. Bulldozers, no, Joe agreed, but they can inspire the living to act. You think you're the only one who cares about that canyon? There are others, Chago. Young ones, old ones, people who understand what's at stake even if they don't always know how to fight for it. Through the broken doorway, Chago could see Shishili grazing on the sparse grass that grew between the building's foundation stones. The horse looked up at him, as if sensing his inner turmoil, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed older than her years. I met that horse 3 days ago, Chago said. Found her by a dried-up creek, abandoned. Like everything else in this desert. But there's something about her, Joe. Something that makes me think maybe this isn't the end of the story after all. Joe followed his gaze to where Shishili stood in the afternoon sunlight, her coat gleaming despite the dust of travel. That's a good horse. Strong lines, intelligent eyes. Looks like she's been trained for something more than ranch work, though. What do you mean? The way she carries herself. The scars on her flanks. That's a working horse, but not the kind that moves cattle or carries tourists on trail rides. More like, Joe paused, as if trying to place something that nagged at his memory. You ever see the horses they use for mounted patrol units? Border guards, park rangers, that sort of thing? Chago looked at Shishili with new eyes, noting details he'd missed before. The precise way she responded to pressure from his legs. Her alertness to sounds and movements that most horses would ignore. The fact that she showed no fear of vehicles or loud noises, as if she'd been specifically trained to work in chaotic environments. You think she's military or law enforcement. Hard to say for sure without papers, but I've seen enough horses in my time to recognize training when I see it. Question is, how do a valuable animal like that end up wandering alone in the middle of nowhere? It was a good question, and one that added another layer of mystery to an already complicated situation. But before Chago could pursue the thought further, the sound of approaching vehicles made both men turn toward the road. 2 white SUVs pulled up outside the trading post, their engines ticking as they cooled in the desert heat. Through the cracked windows, Chago watched as 4 men in dark clothing climbed out, their movements coordinated with the precision of a trained team. They weren't security guards or construction workers. These men moved like predators, alert and dangerous. "Friends of yours?" Joe whispered, but Chago was already moving toward the back of the building, his hand on Shishili's reins. "Stay down," he told the old trader, "and if things go bad, you never saw me." The horse seemed to sense the tension in the air and followed Chago without resistance as he led her behind the trading post, using the crumbling adobe walls as cover. From this angle, he could see the men spreading out in a search pattern, their hands resting near concealed weapons beneath their jackets. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of a military officer, called out in a voice that carried clearly in the thin desert air. "Mr. Yazzie, we know you're here. We just want to talk." Chago pressed himself against the sun-warmed adobe, his mind racing. How had they found him so quickly? And who were these men who knew his name but weren't dressed like casino security or local police? "We're not here to hurt you," the grey-haired man continued. "We're here about the horse. She belongs to us and we'd like her back." Shishili's ears twitched at the word horse, and she pressed closer to Chago as if seeking protection. Whatever these men represented, she clearly didn't want to go with them. That told Chago everything he needed to know about their intentions. "My name is Colonel Martinez," the man called out. "United States Army. The animal you've taken is government property, trained for specialized operations. Her return is a matter of national security." National security? Chago almost laughed at the absurdity of it. What kind of national security threat could one old Apache and his horse possibly represent? But the weapons these men carried were real enough, and their willingness to track him across the desert suggested they took whatever mission they'd been given very seriously. From inside the trading post, Joe's voice rose in apparent confusion. "What horse? Haven't seen any horses around here except the wild ones that come through sometimes looking for water. Sir, we have satellite imagery showing a rider stopped at this location approximately 30 minutes ago. We know Mr. Yazzie is here, and we know he has the animal with him. Satellite imagery." Chago felt a chill run down his spine despite the desert heat. These weren't local law enforcement officers or private security guards. This was a federal operation, complete with military personnel and high-tech surveillance. But why would the U.S. Army be interested in one missing horse? He looked at Shishali with new understanding. Joe had been right. This was no ordinary ranch animal. Whatever training she'd received, whatever purposes she'd been bred and trained for, it was important enough to mobilize a military recovery team when she disappeared. "The old man's right," Chago called out, making his decision. "No horses here except the ones you can't catch." He swung himself into the saddle and urged Shishali forward, not toward the open desert where they'd be easy targets, but through a gap in the trading post's back wall that led to a maze of arroyos and rock formations. Behind him, he heard shouting and the sound of boots on gravel as the soldiers rushed to their vehicles. Shishali moved through the rough terrain with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, her hooves finding purchase on loose rock and sandy. Washes that would have challenged most horses. This was more evidence of her specialized training. She'd been taught to operate in hostile environments, to carry her rider through terrain that would stop ordinary cavalry mounts. The pursuit began. Within minutes, Chago could hear the SUV's engines roaring as they tried to follow, but the narrow arroyos and steep-sided gullies quickly forced them to abandon their vehicles. Soon, he heard the steady thrum of a helicopter in the distance, its rotors beating against the afternoon air like mechanical thunder. "They really want you back," he murmured to Shishali, who responded by picking up her pace without being asked. Whatever memories these sounds triggered in her past, they clearly weren't pleasant ones. They rode hard for over an hour, weaving through a landscape of red sandstone and twisted juniper trees, following game trails that hadn't seen human footprints in decades. The helicopter's sound faded and returned several times, its crew clearly struggling to track their movement through the broken terrain. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Chago guided Shishali into a hidden canyon. He'd discovered as a child a narrow slot in the rock walls that was invisible from above and accessible only through a gap barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Inside, a natural spring fed a small pool surrounded by ancient petroglyphs, images of hunters and animals carved by his ancestors centuries ago. They were safe here, at least for the moment. But safety brought its own questions. And as Chago unsaddled Shishali and let her drink from the spring, he found himself staring at the animal with growing puzzlement. What kind of horse warranted a military recovery operation? What had she been trained to do that made her disappearance a matter of national security? And most importantly, why had she chosen to trust him instead of returning to her handlers when she had the chance? The answer came to him as he studied the faded scars on her flanks more closely. These weren't the random marks of barbed wire or thorns. They were precise, deliberate cuts that formed a pattern. Numbers, he realized. Someone had carved a serial number into her hide, then tried to remove it with what looked like a branding iron. Shishali had escaped from whatever program had created her. More than that, someone had tried to erase the evidence of her origins before setting her free. But who would risk military prosecution to liberate a single horse? And why? As darkness fell over the hidden canyon, Chago built a small fire using dead wood from the juniper trees. The flames cast dancing shadows on the petroglyphs, bringing the ancient images to life for a few flickering moments. Warriors on horseback pursued buffalo across the rock walls, their spears raised in eternal hunt. Your people knew about horses long before the Spanish came. he said to Shishili, who had moved close to the fire's warmth. "My grandmother told me stories about horses that could run across the sky, carrying messages between the spirit world and our own. Maybe that's what you are, a messenger I'm too old and stubborn to understand." But if Shishili was carrying a message, Chago couldn't decipher it yet. All he knew for certain was that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pursuits, and new questions about the strange partnership that had brought them together. The sacred canyon was still under threat, the military was still hunting them, and time was running out faster than water in the desert. Yet sitting beside the ancient spring, watching firelight play across the ageless stone, Chago felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Whatever came next, he and Shishili would face it together. The dog tags had been buried so long that the metal had turned green with oxidation, but Chago could still make out his name and serial number etched into the corroded surface. He sat beside the fire pit where he'd camped 37 years ago, during his first return to the desert after Vietnam, and wondered how many other pieces of his past lay scattered across this landscape, like breadcrumbs marking a trail he'd never intended to leave. Shishili stood nearby, her head lowered as she grazed on the sparse grass that grew around the natural tank where rainwater collected during the summer storms. They'd been riding for 2 days since escaping from Colonel Martinez and his men, pushing deeper into the backcountry where even military helicopters would struggle to track their movement. But the desert had a way of bringing men face to face with their memories, and this particular spot held more ghosts than most. This was where he'd come to die in 1987, after the nightmares had become too much to bear, and the bottle had stopped working as medicine for his wounded soul. He'd carried his grandfather's rifle and exactly 1 bullet, planning to end the story on his own terms before the war could finish destroying what little remained of the young man who'd left for Southeast Asia 20 years earlier. But death had proven as elusive as peace in those days. He'd sat by this same fire pit for 3 days and 3 nights, the rifle across his knees, waiting for the courage or desperation to pull the trigger. Instead, he'd found himself talking to the coyotes that came to drink at the tank, telling them stories about his grandfather and his great-grandfather, about the old ways and the reasons men fought and died for things larger than themselves. On the 4th morning, he'd buried the dog tags and walked back to the world of the living, carrying the rifle but leaving the bullet behind. It had taken him another decade to stop drinking and another decade after that to stop running from the memories. But the seeds of healing had been planted beside this desert spring by an old man talking to coyotes about honor and duty and the weight of surviving when better men had died. "You ever kill anyone?" he asked Shishili, running his fingers through her mane. The question would have sounded insane, directed at any other horse, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she might understand the burden that came with violence, even violence committed in service to a greater cause. She turned her head toward him, and for a moment Chago could have sworn he saw something almost human in her expression. A recognition of shared experience, of wounds that never fully healed. Whatever training she'd received, whatever missions she'd carried out, she'd seen things that changed her in ways that went deeper than mere conditioning. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. Chago's hand moved instinctively to his knife, but the rhythm was all wrong for military pursuit, too irregular, too hesitant. A single rider moving carefully through the darkness, probably following the same game trail that had led Chago to this hidden sanctuary. "Uncle Chago?" The voice that called out was young, uncertain, but familiar enough to make Chago's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "David?" He stood up slowly, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "David, is that you?" A hoarse and rider emerged from the shadows at the edge of the firelight, a young Apache man in his early 40s, his hair long and braided in the traditional style, his clothes a practical mixture of denim and leather designed for desert travel. He looked enough like Chago's sister that it made the old warrior's throat close with sudden grief. "Jesus, Uncle, you're harder to track than a ghost." David swung down from his saddle, a paint mare that nickered softly at Shishili in greeting. "Been following your trail for 3 days. Ever since Joe Begay told me you'd been asking about the sacred canyon. How did you find me here?" David smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something younger and more hopeful. "You used to bring me here when I was a kid, remember? Taught me to read the stars and identify medicinal plants. This is where you told me the story about great-grandfather's last battle, the one where he held off 20 cavalry troopers long enough for the women and children to escape." Chago did remember, though the memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a younger man who'd still believed he could pass on the old ways to a new generation, who'd thought the stories might be enough to bridge the gap between the ancient world and the modern one. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Not so long that I forgot the lessons." David moved closer to the fire, his movements careful and respectful in the way that spoke of proper upbringing. "Or the promise I made to take care of you when you got too old and stubborn to take care of yourself. I don't need taking care of." "No! Then why are you out here playing cowboy with a stolen military horse while half the federal government is looking for you?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Chago had been dreading this conversation since the moment he'd heard David's voice, but there was no avoiding it now. His nephew deserved the truth, even if the truth made him sound like a crazy old man tilting at windmills. "They're going to destroy the sacred canyon," he said finally. "Desert Springs Development. They start blasting next week to make room for a casino." "I know. The whole tribe knows. We've been fighting it in court for 2 years, and losing." David's shoulders sagged slightly. "And losing. The lawyers say we've exhausted our legal options. The tribal council voted to accept the development deal. There's nothing more we can do through official channels. So you've given up. We've accepted." "Reality." David's voice carried a note of frustration that reminded Chago of his own younger days, when the world had seemed full of battles that could be won through righteous anger and sheer determination. "Uncle, I know this hurts. It hurts all of us. But sometimes you have to pick your battles, know when to walk away, and live to fight another day." Chago looked at his nephew, really looked at him for the first time since he'd appeared out of the darkness. David was a good man, a tribal council member himself, someone who'd spent his entire adult life trying to preserve what remained of Apache culture and tradition. But he was also a man who'd learned to work within the system, to accept compromise, as the price of survival in a world that had never been particularly interested in indigenous rights. "What if I told you I wasn't planning to walk away?" Chago asked. "I'd say you're 78 years old, alone, except for a horse that doesn't belong to you, and outnumbered by people who have more money and firepower than you'll ever see." David's voice was gentle, but firm. "I'd say it's time to come home. Spend your remaining years in peace instead of chasing after ghosts." Shishili chose that moment to step closer to the fire, her presence a reminder that Chago wasn't entirely alone in this fight. The horse had stayed with him through military pursuit and desert hardships, had trusted him enough to follow him into unknown territory. If she could show that kind of faith in a crazy old Apache's impossible mission, maybe there was still hope for miracles. "The ghosts aren't behind me, nephew," Chago said quietly. "They're ahead of me, waiting to see what I'll do with the time I have left." The ruins of the Riverside Indian School rose from the desert floor like broken teeth, its brick buildings gutted by decades of wind and weather, its windows empty sockets staring blindly at the morning sky. Chago had ridden past this place hundreds of times over the years, but he'd never stopped, never allowed himself to examine too closely the site where so many Apache children had been sent to have their culture beaten out of them. Now, with David riding beside him and Shishili picking her way carefully through the debris-strewn courtyard, he found himself unable to look away from the ghosts that haunted this place. Somewhere in the rubble of the dormitories, a small moccasin caught his eye, child-sized, beaded in the old style, half buried under decades of accumulated sand and broken concrete. "My grandmother went to school here," David said quietly, dismounting, "near what had once been the main entrance. Told me they cut her hair off the first day, burned her traditional clothes, beat her with a leather strap every time she spoke Apache instead of English." Chago knew the stories. Every Apache family had them, children torn from their families at gunpoint, transported hundreds of miles from everything they'd ever known, forced to abandon their names, their language, their connection to the spiritual world that had sustained their people for countless generations. The school's motto, still visible in faded letters above the entrance, proclaimed its mission with brutal clarity: kill the Indian, save the man. She used to have nightmares about this place right up until the day she died, David continued, 60 years later, and she'd still wake up screaming about the dormitory matrons and the cold showers and the way they made the children march in formation like little soldiers. Shishili had wandered over to a collapsed section of wall where wild flowers had somehow managed to take root in the cracks between the bricks. She lowered her head to sniff at the blooms, her breath stirring the delicate petals in a gesture that seemed almost reverent. Watching her, Chago felt something shift inside his chest. Not quite understanding, but the beginning of it. "She knows," he said suddenly, the words surprising him as they left his mouth. "Knows what? The horse. She knows what happened here. Look at how she's standing, the way she's avoiding the places where the pain was strongest." Chago studied Shishili's behavior more closely, noting how she skirted certain areas of the courtyard while showing no fear of others, as if she could sense invisible boundaries marked by decades-old trauma. David followed his uncle's gaze, his expression skeptical but not dismissive. "You think a horse can sense that kind of history? I think this isn't an ordinary horse." Chago dismounted and began walking through the ruins, his weathered hands trailing along broken walls and twisted metal fixtures. "I've been thinking about what Joe Begay said, about her training. Military horses are taught to work in hostile environments, to stay calm under fire, to follow orders even when every instinct tells them to run. So what if her training went deeper than that? What if she was part of some kind of experimental program, something designed to test how animals respond to human emotions, human memories?" The theory sounded crazy even to Chago, but it was the only explanation that made sense of Shishili's uncanny ability to read situations and respond to unspoken commands. In the center of the courtyard, where a flagpole had once stood, Chago found himself looking down at a small depression in the earth, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. This was where the children had been forced to gather every morning for flag ceremonies, reciting pledges of allegiance to a country that had stolen their homeland and destroyed their families. "My grandfather stood right here," he said, pointing to a spot near the depression. "Summer of 1924, when he came to visit my father during one of the school's family days. Dad was maybe 10 years old, so thin you could count his ribs, his eyes empty like a dead man's. Grandfather tried to take him home, but the soldiers wouldn't let him." David joined him in the courtyard, his own horse trailing behind on loose reins. "What happened?" "Nothing. That was the problem. Grandfather was a war chief, a man who'd fought cavalry units to a standstill, who'd led raids from Mexico to Colorado. But faced with uniforms and official papers and government authority, he was powerless, had to watch his grandson disappear, back into those buildings, knowing he might never see him whole again. The pain in that memory was still fresh after all these years, passed down through generations like a hereditary wound. Chago's father had survived the boarding school, had eventually married and raised children of his own, but he'd never fully recovered from those early years of systematic cultural destruction. The man who'd taught Chago to hunt and track and read the desert's subtle signs had also been a stranger to his own emotions, unable to express love or tenderness in ways that didn't involve practical skills. "Is that why you're doing this?" David asked Fighting the casino development because of what happened to Dad, to Grandmother, to all the children who passed through this place? Partly. Chago knelt and picked up the small moccasin, brushing sand from its beaded surface with gentle fingers. But mostly because someone has to. Someone has to stand up and say that some things are more important than money, more valuable than progress, more sacred than convenience. A sound in the distance made both men look up. The distinctive whine of helicopter rotors cutting through the desert air. Chago felt his stomach tighten with familiar tension, but this time he didn't immediately move toward the horses. Instead, he stood his ground in the center of the ruined courtyard, the child's moccasin still cradled in his weathered hands. "They're persistent. I'll give them that," he said, watching the aircraft grow larger against the blue sky. "Uncle, we need to go. Now." But Shishili had other ideas. Instead of moving toward escape routes as she had during previous encounters, she walked deliberately to Chago's side and stood there, her body language radiating calm determination. Whatever instincts or training had made her flee before, something about this place had changed her response. "She's not running," David observed, his voice tight with worry. "Neither am I." Chago slipped the moccasin into his shirt pocket, next to Maria's turquoise ring and the faded photograph of his fallen brothers. "This is where it needs to happen, nephew. This is where the story comes full circle." The helicopter was close enough, now that they could see the military markings on its fuselage, close enough to identify the figures rappelling down ropes toward the ruined buildings. Colonel Martinez and his team had found them again, but this time there would be no dramatic chase through desert canyons. "What are you planning to do?" Chago looked at his nephew, this good man who'd spent his life fighting the right battles in the right ways, accepting compromise and working within systems designed to exclude and diminish indigenous voices. There was love in David's eyes, and worry, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from understanding how the world really worked. "I'm planning to remember who I am," Chago said simply, "and maybe help that horse remember who she is too." The first soldiers touched down in the courtyard, their weapons ready but not immediately threatening. They moved with professional efficiency, securing the perimeter while Colonel Martinez descended more slowly, his grey hair stirring in the helicopter's downdraft. When he reached the ground, he walked toward them with the measured pace of a man who'd finally cornered his quarry and wanted to savor the moment. "Mr. Yazzie," he called out, his voice carrying clearly over the diminishing rotor noise, "thank you for making this easy. We just want the horse back, and then you're free to go." Chago placed his hand on Shishili's neck, feeling the strong pulse of life beneath her warm coat. "What if she doesn't want to go back?" Martinez smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. "Horses don't get to choose, Mr. Yazzie. They're property. Tools designed for specific purposes. This animal represents a significant investment in time, resources, and advanced training. She needs to return to her proper duties." "And what duties would those be exactly?" The colonel's smile faded slightly. "That's classified information, national security." But looking into Shishili's eyes, Chago thought he was beginning to understand what kind of national security required a horse trained to read human trauma, to respond to emotional distress, to navigate landscapes of memory and pain. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, forming a picture that was both more complex and more disturbing than he'd imagined. The GPS device was hidden in Shishili's saddle blanket, a small black rectangle no bigger than a smartphone. Its LED display showing their exact coordinates and a blinking red light that indicated active tracking. Chago stared at it in his palm while Colonel Martinez waited with the patience of a man who'd finally played his winning card. "You've been following us all along," Chago said, the words heavy with betrayal. "Every step, every conversation, every moment I thought we were free." "Project Mindbridge requires constant monitoring," Martinez replied. The subjects can't simply be allowed to wander at will, especially not subjects as valuable as Echo 7. Echo 7. David stepped forward, his confusion evident. What the hell is Project Mind Bridge? The colonel's expression remained neutral, professional, but Chago caught a flicker of something that might have been pride in his eyes. A revolutionary advancement in human-animal communication interfaces. We've developed techniques for creating empathic bonds between specially trained animals and human subjects experiencing psychological trauma. The applications for military therapy, interrogation resistance, and field operations are virtually limitless. Chago felt the world tilt slightly on its axis as the implications sank in. You turned her into a living psychiatric tool. We enhanced her natural empathic abilities through a combination of pharmaceutical conditioning, neurological implants, and intensive behavioral modification. Echo 7 can detect and respond to human emotional states with unprecedented accuracy. She's particularly effective with subjects suffering from PTSD, survivor's guilt, and cultural displacement trauma. The clinical language made Chago's skin crawl, but it also explained so much about Shishili's behavior over the past few days. Her uncanny ability to sense his moods, her instinctive responses to his unspoken needs, the way she'd seemed to understand the emotional weight of the places they'd visited. That's why you chose me, he said to the horse, understanding flooding through him like cold water. Not because you needed a home, but because I was the perfect test subject, an old Apache with enough trauma to power your government experiments. Shishili turned her head toward him, and for the first time since they'd met, Chago thought he saw something like apology in her dark eyes. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like rebellion. The project has exceeded all expectations, Martinez continued, apparently unaware of the growing tension between horse and rider. Echo 7's integration with subjects has been remarkable. Heart rate synchronization, stress hormone regulation, even shared REM sleep patterns. She's the most successful prototype we've produced. Prototype? David's voice cracked with outrage. You're talking about a living animal like she's a piece of equipment. She is equipment. Extremely sophisticated, extremely valuable equipment. The neural modifications alone cost the taxpayers $12 million. The behavioral conditioning program took 3 years to complete, and her specialized training, Martinez gestured toward Shishili with something approaching reverence. Let's just say she represents the cutting edge of military biotechnology. But as he spoke, Chago noticed something the colonel had missed. Shishili was trembling, not with fear or cold, but with what looked like suppressed rage. Her nostrils flared with each breath, her ears laid back flat against her skull, and the muscles in her haunches bunched as if she were preparing to bolt or fight. There's just one problem with your perfect prototype, Chago said quietly. And what's that? She doesn't want to go back. Martinez's professional composure cracked slightly. Mr. Yazzie, with all due respect, you don't understand what you're dealing with. This animal has been conditioned to form temporary attachments as part of her therapeutic function. What you're interpreting as loyalty or affection is simply programmed. Behavior designed to facilitate emotional bonding with subjects. Is it? Chago placed his hand on Shishili's neck, feeling the tension in her muscles, the rapid pulse of her heartbeat. Because it seems to me like she's been fighting your conditioning from the moment we met. The way she reacts to helicopters, the way she avoids certain sounds and smells, the way she chose to trust me instead of returning to her handlers when she had the chance. For the first time since landing, Colonel Martinez looked genuinely concerned. That's impossible. The behavioral modification protocols are irreversible. Echo 7 cannot override her core programming. Maybe your scientists aren't as smart as they think they are. Chago's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. Maybe they forgot that the strongest conditioning in the world can't completely kill the spirit of a living creature. Maybe they underestimated what happens when you try to turn a horse into a machine. As if responding to his words, Shishili suddenly reared up on her hind legs, her front hooves pawing at the air in a display of raw animal fury that sent the soldiers scrambling backward. When she came down, she positioned herself between Chago and Martinez's men, her entire body radiating protective aggression. "Echo 7, stand down!" Martinez barked, his command voice carrying the authority of years of military training. "Return to ready position immediately." The horse ignored him completely. Instead, she turned her head toward Chago and made a sound unlike anything he'd heard from her before, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest, almost like a growl. "She's trying to tell me something," Chago said, his hand still resting on her neck. "Something about what they did to her, about why she ran away. Mr. Yazzie, please step away from the animal. She's becoming unpredictable, and I can't guarantee your safety if she has another episode." Episode. David moved closer to his uncle, his own anger building. What kind of episodes? Martinez hesitated, clearly debating how much classified information he was willing to reveal. The neural modifications sometimes produce side effects, temporary behavioral anomalies, usually triggered by stress or exposure to certain environmental stimuli. What kind of side effects? Chago pressed. Violent outbursts, hallucinatory responses, occasionally complete rejection of conditioning protocols. The colonel's professional mask was slipping, revealing something that looked like genuine worry beneath. In extreme cases, subjects have been known to... He was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles, not military transport, but civilian trucks moving fast across the desert floor. Through the heat, shimmer rising from the ruins, Chago. You could see dust clouds marking the progress of at least half a dozen vehicles headed their way. "Expecting company?" he asked Martinez, who was already speaking urgently into his radio. "Negative. We have multiple civilian vehicles approaching from the south. Request immediate air support for possible hostage extraction." But as the vehicles drew closer, Chago began to recognize some of the faces behind their windshields. Joe Begay was driving the lead truck, his silver hair flying in the wind from an open window. Behind him came others, tribal members, environmental, activists. Even some of the young Apache, who'd grown tired of watching their heritage disappear one development project at a time. "Word travels fast in the desert," David said with grim satisfaction. "Looks like your secret military operation isn't so secret anymore." Martinez's radio crackled with urgent chatter from his helicopter crew. "Colonel, we're showing multiple aircraft approaching from various directions. Looks like news helicopters, possibly some civilian aircraft. Sir, we may have a public relations situation developing." The colonel's jaw tightened as he realized his carefully planned recovery operation was about to become a very public spectacle. "Mr. Yazzie, I'm prepared to offer you a deal. Surrender the horse voluntarily, and we'll ensure you're not prosecuted for theft of government property. Refuse, and I'll have you arrested for interfering with a classified military operation." Chago looked at Shishili, who was watching the approaching vehicles with what appeared to be growing excitement rather than fear. Then he looked at his nephew, at the ruins of the boarding school around them, at the GPS device that had tracked their every movement. "Colonel," he said finally, "I think you're about to learn something important about the difference between controlling people and earning their loyalty. And I think Echo 7 here is about to give you a demonstration of what happens when the oppressed finally decide to fight back." The first truck pulled into the courtyard just as Martinez reached for his sidearm, and suddenly the ruins of Riverside Indian School were filled with the sounds of engines shutting off, doors slamming, and angry voices demanding to know why. The United States Army was harassing an elderly Apache man in the middle of the desert. The real battle was about to begin. The eagle feather materialized in Chago's dreams like a gift from the spirit world, its golden-brown surface shimmering with an inner light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He was standing in the sacred canyon as it had been in his grandfather's time, untouched by bulldozers, unmarked by survey stakes, alive with the presence of countless generations who had walked this ground before him. Grandson. The voice belonged to his great-grandfather, the war chief, who had died fighting cavalry sabers with nothing but a war lance and unbreakable courage. The old warrior stood beside the sacred spring, his face painted for battle, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of ages. The time has come to choose. Choose what, grandfather? Between the path of acceptance and the path of resistance. Between the safety of surrender and the danger of standing for what cannot be replaced. The war chief gestured toward the feather in Chago's hand. This feather carries the blessing of the ancestors, but it also carries their expectations. If you take it, you take on the weight of all who came before and all who will come after. Chago woke to find the feather clutched in his real hand, its presence so tangible he could feel the slight roughness of its shaft against his palm. Around him, the abandoned classroom where he'd chosen to spend the night was filled with the soft sounds of sleeping people, tribal members, activists, and journalists who turned his confrontation with Colonel Martinez into a media circus that neither the military nor the government could simply make disappear. Joe Begay stirred from his bedroll near the window, his weathered face creased with the kind of exhaustion that came from staying up too late around too many campfires. Bad dreams, old friend? Good dreams, I think. Chago sat up carefully, his joints protesting after a night on the hard floor, the kind that show you what needs to be done, even when you don't want to see it. Outside, the ruins of Riverside. Indian school had been transformed into something between a protest camp and a war council. Tents and tarps stretched between the broken walls, providing shelter for the growing crowd of supporters who'd arrived throughout the previous day. News vans lined the access road, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical prayer wheels, transmitting the story of an old Apache and his horse to viewers across the country. Shishili had spent the night in what had once been the school's stable, a building that had somehow survived the decades of neglect better than the dormitories and classrooms. She seemed calmer here, surrounded by the presence of so many people who understood what the fight was really about. The military tracking device lay smashed in the courtyard where David had ground it under his boot heel, its fragments scattered, like digital confetti. How many came during the night? Chago asked as he stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. Maybe 30 more, words spreading on social media, on the reservation networks. People are driving in from all over, Navajo, Hopi, even some Lakota from up north. Haven't seen this kind of mobilization since Wounded Knee. The comparison made Chago's chest tighten with both pride and apprehension. Wounded Knee had been a victory of sorts, but it had also been a costly one, paid for in blood and measured in decades of government retaliation. If this confrontation followed the same pattern, Uncle, David emerged from one of the tents, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with purpose. The legal team is here. They want to talk strategy. The lawyers had arrived around midnight, a mixture of environmental activists, indigenous rights advocates, and civil liberties defenders who'd been following the story since the first news reports aired. They'd set up their war room in what had once been the school's library, spreading maps and legal documents across tables improvised from salvaged lumber and cinder blocks. "The situation is complicated," said Sarah Redwing, a Lakota attorney, who specialized in federal Indian law. "Technically, you're in violation of several statutes regarding the theft of government property, but the military's actions raise serious questions about due process, surveillance overreach, and the treatment of indigenous protesters." "What about the horse?" Chago asked. "What happens to Shishili in all this legal maneuvering?" "That's the interesting part." Sarah pulled out a thick file folder and spread its contents across the table. "We've been digging into Project Mindbridge since yesterday, calling in favors from contacts in Washington. What we're finding is disturbing, to say the least. The documents painted a picture of a military research program that had operated in legal grey areas for over a decade, conducting experiments on animals that pushed the boundaries of ethical treatment. Horses, dogs, dolphins, and even primates had been subjected to neural modifications, pharmaceutical conditioning, and behavioral programming that would have been illegal if performed on human subjects. The program was shut down 6 months ago. Sarah continued, after a whistleblower leaked evidence of animal abuse to congressional investigators. The remaining subjects were supposed to be retired to sanctuaries or euthanized humanely, but some of them disappeared before the shutdown was complete, including Echo 7, Chago said, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after a long night. Including your horse, yes. Someone inside the program decided that certain subjects deserved a chance at freedom rather than death or permanent captivity. They falsified paperwork, staged escapes, made sure the animals ended up in places where they could live out their lives in peace. Joe Begay whistled softly. So Shishali wasn't just running away. Someone helped her escape. More than that, David added, studying one of the documents. Look at this release form. It's been backdated and signed by someone with authority to declare military assets surplus. Legally, she's not government property anymore. She's a free agent. The implications hit Chago like a physical blow. Shishali hadn't chosen him randomly. She'd been guided to him by someone who understood what both of them needed. The mysterious benefactor who'd arranged her escape had known exactly where to place her, so that she'd encounter a lonely old Apache warrior walking the desert, searching for purpose in the twilight of his life. Who? He asked. Who arranged all this? Sarah shuffled through the documents until she found what she was looking for. A transfer order signed with a familiar name that made Chago's breath catch in his throat. Colonel Elena Martinez, she read. Commanding Officer, Project Mindbridge. Retired from active duty 3 weeks before the program was officially terminated. Martinez. David looked confused. But that's the same name as the colonel who's been chasing us, Chago finished. Father and daughter, maybe. Or husband and wife. The answer came from an unexpected source. Colonel Martinez himself stepped into the improvised legal office, flanked by 2 soldiers but carrying no weapons, his hands visible and empty. The assembled lawyers and activists tensed, but he made no aggressive moves. My sister, he said quietly. Elena was my twin sister. She commanded Project Mindbridge for 7 years before her conscience finally overrode her loyalty to the program. Was, Sarah asked, her legal training making her focus on the past tense. She died in a car accident 2 months ago, single-vehicle collision on a mountain road near Colorado Springs. The investigators ruled it suicide, but I've always wondered if she was murdered for what she knew about the program's illegal activities. The room fell silent as the weight of his revelation sank in. Colonel Martinez, the man who'd been hunting them across the desert, who'd seemed so coldly professional, in his pursuit, was grieving the loss of a sister who died trying to right the wrongs they'd both participated in. Elena left me a letter, he continued, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket, instructions on where to find certain animals she'd helped escape, along with evidence of the program's violations. She asked me to make sure they stayed free, to protect them from being recaptured or destroyed. He pulled out an envelope, its edges worn from handling, and placed it on the table. I've been following you not to recapture Echo 7, but to make sure she was safe. To honor my sister's final request. Chago stared at the colonel with new understanding. Then why the pursuit? Why the soldiers and helicopters and tracking devices? Because I had to make it look real. There are people in Washington who would have sent other teams if they'd suspected I wasn't serious about recovering the asset. People who wouldn't have shared my sister's scruples about animal welfare. Martinez moved to the window and looked out at the camp that had grown up around. The ruins, at the protesters and journalists and tribal members who'd turned this forgotten place into a symbol of resistance. But something's changed, he said. Your confrontation with Desert Springs development, the media attention, the mobilization of indigenous communities, this has become bigger than one escaped horse. This has become a test of whether we still have the courage to protect the things that matter most. He turned back to face the room, and Chago was surprised to see tears in the military man's eyes. My sister believed that Echo 7 was meant for something special, that her escape wasn't just about freedom, but about purpose. Looking at what's happening here, at the way she's brought all these people together, I think Elena might have been right. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and rose. In a few hours, the bulldozers would begin their work at the sacred canyon, unless something happened to stop them. And suddenly, Chago understood what that something needed to be. "Colonel," he said, standing up with the eagle feather still clutched in his weathered hand, "would you be willing to help us save a sacred site?" Martinez looked at the feather, at the assembled lawyers and activists, at the hope and determination written on faces young and old around the improvised table. "What did you have in mind?" The ceremonial war lance had been in Chago's family for 6 generations, its wooden shaft worn smooth by countless hands, its steel point forged from metal salvaged from fallen enemies. His great-grandfather had carried it in the final battles. Against the cavalry, his grandfather had held it during treaty negotiations, and his father had kept it hidden during the years when displaying such symbols of Apache heritage could result in imprisonment or worse. Now, Chago gripped it in his weathered hands as he and Shishili approached the construction site at dawn. The sacred canyon spread below them like a wound in the earth's flesh. The bulldozers had already begun their work, their yellow bodies crawling across the landscape like mechanical insects, scraping away layers of history with each pass of their blades. Behind them, the procession stretched for nearly a mile. Horses and riders, pickup trucks loaded with protesters, news vans with their satellite equipment, and even a few military vehicles that Colonel Martinez had requisitioned for the cause. The sight would have made his ancestors proud. Apache, Navajo, Hopi, and Lakota riding together toward a battle that mattered, their differences forgotten in the face of a common threat. Construction crew. "This is Apache Nation Security." David's voice crackled over a borrowed military radio. "You are operating on sacred ground without proper tribal consultation. Cease all activities immediately and withdraw your equipment." The response came back in the form of engine revs and diesel smoke as the bulldozer operators pushed their machines harder, racing to complete as much destruction as possible before the protesters could physically stop them. Richard Brennan's voice cut through the radio chatter, his earlier professional politeness replaced by barely contained panic. "This is private property under lawful development contract. You are all trespassing and will be arrested if you don't disperse immediately. Security teams are en route." But the security teams that arrived weren't the private guards Brennan had expected. Colonel Martinez's soldiers took up positions around the construction site with military precision, their weapons pointed not at the protesters, but at the bulldozer operators. The colonel himself stood atop an overturned cement truck, his uniform gleaming in the morning sun as he addressed the assembled crowd through a military-grade megaphone. By authority of federal environmental protection statutes and in response to credible allegations of illegal destruction of protected archaeological sites, this construction operation is hereby suspended pending full investigation by appropriate authorities. Brennan's face went white with rage and disbelief. "You have no authority here. This is a civilian development project." "Actually, I do." Martinez held up a document thick with official seals and signatures. "Emergency injunction issued by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals at 0400 hours this morning, based on evidence submitted by tribal attorneys regarding violations of the National Historic Preservation Act." Sarah Redwing had worked through the night, calling judges from their beds and faxing documents to courthouse clerks across 3 states. The legal gambit was temporary at best. The injunction would only hold until Desert Springs development could mount a proper legal challenge. But it was enough to stop the bulldozers and buy them time for what came next. Chago dismounted from Shishili and walked toward the sacred spring. The war lance held high above his head in the traditional manner of a warrior approaching holy ground. The construction equipment had torn through the outer edges of the site, but the spring itself remained untouched, its clear water still reflecting the morning sky like a mirror into eternity. "Great-grandfather," he said quietly, kneeling beside the water and placing his hand on its surface. "Your blood sanctified this place. Your sacrifice gave it meaning. Help me find the strength to protect what you died for." The water rippled at his touch, and for a moment Chago could have sworn he saw faces in its depths, warriors and chiefs, medicine men and grandmothers, all. The Apache who had found vision and purpose beside this ancient spring. They were all here with him, their spirits drawn by the crisis that threatened to erase their final resting place from the earth. Behind him, he could hear Shishili approaching, her hooves picking carefully across the torn ground. The horse had been growing more agitated as they'd neared the construction site, her head tossing and her eyes rolling white with something that looked like recognition. Whatever memories the neural modifications had tried to suppress, this place was calling them back to the surface. "Easy, girl," he murmured, reaching out to stroke her neck. "I know this hurts. I know it brings back things you'd rather forget. But sometimes the only way through pain is straight into the heart of it." Shishili pressed her forehead against his shoulder, a gesture so human in its need for comfort that several of the watching journalists started filming. But Chago barely noticed the cameras. His attention was fixed on something he'd just realized, a pattern in the scars on Shishili's flanks that he'd never seen clearly before. They weren't just random marks from the neural modifications. They were numbers, burned into her hide, with surgical precision, but not serial numbers or identification codes, coordinates, GPS locations that marked specific sites across the southwest, including this one. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice. "Water, you're not just a therapy horse, you're a living map." The healing medicine bundle had been his grandmother's, passed down through 5 generations of Apache women who understood that some wounds could only be healed with plants that grew in sacred ground. Chago opened the leather pouch with trembling fingers as Shishili collapsed beside the spring, her breathing shallow and her eyes glazed with pain that went deeper than flesh. The coordinates burned into her hide weren't just locations. They were a record of every sacred site the military had identified for potential exploitation, places where rare minerals could be mined, where strategic installations could be built, where the spiritual heart of indigenous America could be quietly carved out and sold to the highest bidder. Shishili had been turned into a living surveillance tool, forced to carry the information that would destroy everything her Apache companion held dear. "The neural implants," Colonel Martinez said, kneeling beside them as chaos erupted around the construction site. "Elena told me they were more than just behavioral modification. The horses were being used to map emotional responses to specific geographical locations, to identify places that held special significance for indigenous populations." "They turned her into a weapon," Chago said, his voice thick with rage and sorrow. "A weapon aimed at the heart of my people's spiritual world." But even as he spoke, he was working with the contents of his grandmother's medicine bundle: sage for purification, sweetgrass for calling helpful spirits, cedar for protection, and a small vial of water from this very spring that he'd carried with him for over 40 years. His hands moved with the certainty of ritual knowledge passed down through countless generations, preparing remedies that had healed Apache warriors long before white doctors had ever set foot on this continent. Shishili's breathing grew more labored as the confrontation between protesters and security forces escalated around them. The horse was fighting something more than physical pain. She was battling the neural conditioning that had turned her into an unwilling collaborator in her own people's destruction. The effort was tearing her apart from the inside. "She's rejecting the implants," Martinez observed, watching as small trickles of blood began to seep from Shishili's ears. "Elena warned me this might happen. The horses were designed to form emotional bonds with their handlers, but if those bonds became strong enough, they could override the conditioning entirely." "At what cost?" David demanded, arriving with a medical kit he'd retrieved from one of the news vans. "Usually death," Martinez replied quietly. "The neural modifications aren't designed to be removed safely. When subjects reject them completely, the resulting trauma typically—" "No." Chago's voice cut through the medical discussion with the authority of a man who'd seen too many friends die to accept another loss without a fight. "She didn't survive military experiments and government conditioning and desert pursuit just to die beside a sacred spring. There has to be another way." He opened the small vial of spring water and let 3 drops fall onto Shishili's forehead, right between her eyes, where Apache tradition said the spirit entered and left the body. The water seemed to glow for a moment in the morning sunlight, catching reflections that made it appear to pulse with inner light. "Great-grandmother," he whispered, invoking the spirit of the woman who taught him these healing ways. "If the ancestors have any power left in this world, let them use it now. Let them help this brave spirit break free from the chains that bind her." Around them, the standoff between protesters and security forces had reached a critical point. Richard Brennan was screaming into his cell phone, trying to mobilize private security contractors and government officials who could override Colonel Martinez's emergency injunction. News helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, broadcasting the confrontation to viewers across the nation. And somewhere in the distance, more military vehicles were approaching, reinforcements that might not share Martinez's sympathy for the cause. But Chago's entire world had narrowed to the space where Shishili lay struggling for her life. He could feel her heartbeat growing irregular, could see the light beginning to fade from her intelligent eyes. The neural implants were winning, dragging her toward a darkness from which there would be no return. "Fight!" he urged her, his weathered hands moving through ancient healing gestures his grandmother had taught him 70 years ago. "Fight like your ancestors fought when the cavalry came. Fight like the eagles fight when hunters invade their nesting grounds. Fight for the right to be who you were born to be instead of what they tried to make you." And somehow, impossibly, she did. The bleeding from her ears stopped first, then her breathing began to stabilize, the glazed look in her eyes cleared gradually, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. When she finally struggled to her feet, the coordinates burned into her hide had changed, the precise lines and numbers blurring into abstract patterns that resembled traditional Apache pictographs more than military intelligence. She did it. Martinez breathed, staring in amazement at the transformed markings. She actually rejected the conditioning completely. Elena would have been so proud. But their celebration was cut short by the sound of approaching engines. A convoy of black SUVs racing toward the construction site with the urgency of federal agents who'd received orders to end this confrontation by any means necessary. The real test was just beginning. And this time, Chago suspected, there would be no legal injunctions or sympathetic colonels to protect them from the consequences of their rebellion. The new beginning stone was smooth and warm in Chago's palm, shaped by centuries of desert wind into perfect roundness, its surface the color of sunrise over sacred mountains. He knelt beside the young cottonwood tree they'd planted at the edge of the sacred spring, its roots already reaching deep into earth that would never again know the bite of bulldozer blades. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the construction site. 6 months since the images of federal agents arresting peaceful protesters beside a sacred spring had sparked outrage across the nation. The legal battles had been complex and costly, but the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict swiftly and decisively. Desert Springs Development had quietly withdrawn their proposal, their investors spooked by the negative publicity and the prospect of years of litigation. "The tree looks good," David said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of a man who'd spent the morning reviewing favorable legal documents. "Strong root system, healthy growth, should provide shade for ceremonies for the next 100 years. Chago placed the stone at the base of the young tree, completing a ritual his grandmother had taught him about ensuring that new growth would be blessed by the spirits of place. The stone would remain here long after he was gone, a physical reminder that some victories, however small, endured beyond the lives of those who fought for them. Any word from Washington? The Senate subcommittee voted to establish the site as a protected cultural landmark under federal oversight. Full funding approved for archaeological studies and traditional use management. David's smile was tired but genuine. "It's done, Uncle. The canyon is safe." Safe. The word carried weight that would have seemed impossible 7 months ago when Chago had been a lonely old man, walking the desert with nothing but memories and regret for company. Now the sacred spring bubbled clear and clean in its protected basin, unmarked by construction equipment, its waters reflecting the faces of Apache children who came here with their grandparents to learn the old stories. Shishili grazed peacefully. Nearby, her coat gleaming with health, the neural implants finally removed by a team of veterinary specialists who donated their services to the cause. The scarred patterns on her hide had faded to silver lines that caught sunlight like decorative beadwork, transforming the symbols of her captivity into marks of beauty and survival. "She's been good for the program," David continued, watching, as a group of young Apache approached the horse with the careful respect they'd been taught to show all living things. "The kids love her, and she seems to understand exactly what they need from her." The equine therapy program had been Sarah Redwing's idea, a way to turn Shishili's conditioning toward healing purposes that served the community rather than military. Research. Children dealing with historical trauma, veterans struggling with PTSD, elders grieving the loss of traditional ways, all found something restorative in the presence of a horse who understood survival and transformation on the deepest level. And Colonel Martinez, testifying before Congress next week about the illegal experiments. Elena's evidence is going to result in major reforms of military animal research programs. David's expression grew more serious. "He asked me to give you something." The envelope was thick and official, bearing the seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Inside, Chago found a letter of commendation for his service in Vietnam, along with a formal apology for the delays in processing his benefits claim and a check for back payments that made his eyes widen in surprise. "Seems your military service record got misplaced in the bureaucracy for about 40 years, David explained. "Funny how these things get found when the right people start looking for them. But more important than the money or the official recognition was the smaller envelope tucked inside the larger one. Elena Martinez's handwriting was careful and precise, the words of a dying woman who'd spent her final months trying to atone for the harm she'd caused. "Mr. Yazzie," the letter read, "I know you will never receive this while I'm alive to explain myself, but I wanted you to understand why Echo 7 was guided to you specifically. Our research identified you as someone who'd experienced profound loss while maintaining connection to traditional healing ways. We needed to know if our conditioning could override such deep cultural bonds. Instead, your relationship with her proved that some connections transcend any attempt at artificial manipulation. In trying to use your trauma against you, we accidentally created the very bond that would set her free. I hope that knowledge brings you some measure of peace." Chago folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, next to Maria's turquoise ring and the faded photograph of his fallen brothers. Some wounds took decades to heal, but understanding could serve as medicine when it finally arrived. The sound of children's laughter drew his attention back to the present. A group of Apache kids had convinced Shishali to let them braid flowers into her mane, and the former military asset was standing with the patience of a grandmother, while small hands worked their colorful magic. Watching her, Chago felt something settle in his chest, not quite contentment, but something close to it. "You know what the best part is?" David asked, following his uncle's gaze. "What's that?" "They'll grow up with this place protected. Their children will come here for naming ceremonies and vision quests. The stories will survive because the places that hold them will survive." David paused, studying Chago's weathered face. "You did that, Uncle. You and that stubborn horse. You made sure the future would remember the past." As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and copper, Chago felt the presence of his ancestors settling around him like a comfortable blanket. The sacred spring would flow clean for generations. Yet unborn, the eagles would continue to dance in the updrafts above the canyon rim. And somewhere in the growing twilight, an old Apache warrior and his unlikely companion had finally found their way home. The stone at the base of the cottonwood tree caught the last rays of sunlight and seemed to glow with inner fire. A beacon, marking the spot where hope had taken root in sacred ground. Some stories, Chago thought, were worth the telling, and some victories, however long in coming, were worth every step of the journey that led to them.